Roger Williams University is hosting a crisis management seminar on May 3rd at their Providence campus. Crises, whether a natural disaster, cyber attack, or financial instability, can have severe repercussions if not handled properly. This is where crisis management plays a pivotal role. Join Roger Williams MBA students and expert speakers to learn how to prepare for the unexpected. The program is totally free and open to the public. You can register online at rwu.edu/events/crisis-management-symposium.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by the University of Rhode Island Online, who are offering a cannabis certificate program. The legalization of recreational cannabis that went into effect last year can open doors for your career. If you're already in the industry or wondering what is the best path to break into the cannabis field, the University of Rhode Island has a program to help you become highly competitive in numerous areas of the cannabis industry. Fully accredited by URI's College of Pharmacy, the certificate program is 100% online, and it can be completed in just 2 semesters. Learn more by visiting uri.edu/online/cannabis or give them a call at 401-874-5280. Representative David Morales, world champion in my mind. Let's take a look at this.
Look at this beauty.
This beauty.
Look at it. And I cannot thank you enough for the invitation, Bill. I'm excited to have finally made my long-awaited debut right here on B-Town.
I was surprised that we hadn't done anything. I mean, it kind of, the pandemic changed the dynamic of everything. So there's a lot of people that, like, my grand scheme or my grand plans of, like, who would come on and all, like, my notebooks, or not even notebooks, legal pads filled with guests basically got crumpled up once we hit 2020. So now it really feels like a reset. And now we're here in person, and we were talking offline. Like, most of the episodes have either been via Zoom or, like, just haven't happened. And it felt good. When I woke up this morning, I was like, wow, we're going to be in person again. And that in and of itself is kind of an accomplishment. Like, as a species that we're here, it is 2023. It's been a long time, but we're able to just hang out in person and not, I mean, COVID's not over, but it's...
But we're able to have social interactions like this.
Totally.
And we don't have to be as concerned as we might have been in years prior, thanks to the vaccine, the high rates of vaccines that we've seen across our communities, and just the fact that, thankfully, relatively compared to the rest of the country, I think Rhode Island has done a good job of keeping our community safe to the extent that we have been able to manage our complicated healthcare system.
Yeah, no question about it. It's something that we just kind of take for granted now. But having been in the thick of it for so many years, and how disruptive that was and how tragic it was to be in the thick of COVID, this moment is something that I'm trying to, like, enjoy. Like, every time there's a live performance or every time that we have an in-person interview, whatever it is, it's kind of like, well, that was taken away. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, taken away, but it went away. And
makes you value it all that much more, though.
Totally.
And I have the similar feelings anytime that we have heavy presence of, like, lobbying at the State House, specifically from, like, advocacy groups.
Yeah.
Right. When I started in the legislature in 2020, we were at the vets.
Yeah,
we were not even allowed to be at the State House. And then when we were there was heavy limitations as to the presence of being able to have advocates on the floor.
Yeah.
Whereas now I head into the State House by 3:50 p.m. and it's absolutely crowded. Mm-hmm. Same thing when it comes to performing for professional wrestling. We have venues that are filled up with 200 plus people. And I know for a fact that, again, had we turned the clock back 2.5 years ago, that would not have been allowed. Instead, you would have guys in a warehouse wrestling, taping it, and then airing it on YouTube with the hopes that we crack 100 views.
Right. And that wrestling is such, like, any sort of sport was such a challenge during the pandemic. And I mean, any kind of contact sport, there were ways that it was at the highest levels it was able to happen, I guess, but daunting nonetheless to imagine any kind of, like, physical contact with another person was terrifying. So, yeah, I'm with you. And so you are holding in your hand
the Renegade Wrestling Alliance Hype Championship.
Yes. So, wow, this is like, oh my goodness. So I'm now holding it in my hand.
It is a championship with a very historic lineage, and just for context, it was retired back in the fall. But being the commissioner of the RWA, where I have full-fledged authority, I decided to exercise my power to reinstate the championship because I had announced to everyone that I would be competing in my first match, which I did successfully.
You did.
I wanted to ensure that if I was going to compete, it wasn't going to be some throwaway one-on-one match that you would forget about. It was going to be the historic return of the Hype Championship, and most importantly, your favorite commissioner walking away as the victorious champion.
Walking away as the champion. I mean, it reminds me of Mr. McMahon winning the championship in a way, but it kind of goes several steps further.
I mean, to be fair, I did have some assistance as related to defeating the mighty Bosch in order to win the championship. However, if you watch the editor's cut, then you'll just watch me pin him without much assistance.
I think everyone should watch the editor's cut and then just like celebrate that fact. So when did you get into wrestling?
So I grew up watching wrestling at the tender age of 8. My older cousins, who I've often cited as being like my older brothers that I never had, were huge fans and introduced me to Monday Night Raw, specifically the wrestlers being The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and John Cena. And I immediately fell in love. And as someone who did not grow up with cable, I often watched Friday Night SmackDown when it would air on UPN. And I remember my first distinct memory being Rey Mysterio facing off against John Bradshaw Layfield, JBL, who was one of the biggest heels as a part of the quote-unquote ruthless aggression era. And I was just hooked. So I had some of the action figures that we could afford, in addition to just playing endless hours of SmackDown versus Raw, where I became very familiar with the roster. And I fell in love with, again, professional wrestling to me is a creative form of theater, athleticism, and humor and storyline-driven drama all wrapped into one presentation.
That's exactly right, in my opinion as well. It gets a reputation for being, I hate to use this term on anything, but I think there is a notion that's kind of a lowbrow sort of type of thing, and whatever, like anybody can judge anything as they like, but it is an art form. And something interesting, number one, the fact that you didn't grow up with cable, that was the same for me. You know, I'd love to get back to that, but on wrestling, I was kind of out by the time that I was huge into it when really the 94, 95, 93, I was at the Providence Civic Center for Royal Rumble 94 when the casket match, The Undertaker rose from
the grave and appeared on the Titantron.
Exactly. But I kind of fell out of it once the Attitude Era started and just moved on to different things, I guess, especially in sports. Like I became really into football and basketball. I was already kind of into college basketball, but I came heavy into that and just kind of slipped away and didn't really check in, especially not having cable. I missed the Monday Night Wars, which was WWF Monday Night Raw versus basically and WCW Monday Nitro, two competing brands.
And one can argue that was the height of professional wrestling.
Absolutely. And the competition was just so amazing. The ratings battles, and at one point WCW really pulled away, and then ultimately Vince McMahon and WWF bought WCW. And it's just like really fast because there's also that element of like business and a creative business that grew into now we just saw the sale of WWF, 51% to the company that owns UFC.
Exactly.
So
WWE and wrestling in general continues to evolve. And I think for a while, professional wrestling was stagnant within the mid-2000s because of a lack of competition. But thankfully, I would argue professional wrestling is more competitive than ever with different promotions that go well beyond just WWE. We're looking at All Elite Wrestling, TNA Impact Wrestling, which has now been around for 20 years, Ring of Honor. There's so many different options and varieties for people to choose from, and they all tailor to different styles. I think WWE's always had the reputation of being a lot more family-friendly post-Attitude Era, whereas All Elite Wrestling caters to the more independent wrestling fan. And then I would obviously make the argument that some of the most important wrestling is the one that happens literally within the realms of your city or town, which is local independent professional wrestling. So I've always told everyone that my involvement within the Renegade Wrestling Alliance and just the local independent wrestling scene is for the purpose of trying to normalize the idea of watching professional wrestling. The idea that you take your children or you go out with your friends to a baseball game or you go out to Gillette Stadium to watch the Patriots perform. I want to have that same level of normalcy around going down to the local VFW on a Saturday night to watch local independent wrestling.
Yes.
Or vice versa, be in a situation where as much as we enjoy watching Monday Night Football at our local sports bar or restaurant, what if we were also in a reality where you can walk into a restaurant, a sports bar, and watch Monday Night Raw or Friday Night SmackDown playing as well? Mm-hmm. So for me, it's about like trying to normalize that idea that professional wrestling is for everyone. And there are different promotions that cater to different audiences as well.
Totally. And a couple things you said there. Number one, you used the word perform around the Patriots. And that's something that's so important to remember as well. We see this with some of the behavior that people exhibited during the departure of Ed Cooley from Providence. You know, he took a job as the head coach of Georgetown in college basketball. And I kept making the argument, you know, sort of not really a jab, but just being like, look, these guys are entertainers. Yeah. This is a performance. College basketball is a performance. Football is a performance. Wrestling is a performance. And if you frame it all like that, it's really nothing more. Anything else is jingoism. You know, the idea that like, because the college is situated in Providence, Rhode Island, you know, they're somehow playing for you. I mean, maybe, but there's some connection to your hometown, and you obviously have the support of your fans, but they're just entertainers. And that's what sport is. So that's what sport entertainment obviously is literally. But
and most of the time, the priority tends to be the bottom line in terms of profit and cash. And perception as well. But perception is not as influential as the bottom line or one's profit margin.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the idea of indie is, you know, this is the heart of what I am, and in so many ways that it's the same in music where, you know, somebody can make an argument, you know, especially when I was in my 20s in New York, like paying for things with quarters and like squatting and whatever. And people will be like, when are you going to get a job? Or more than anything, why don't you go on American Idol? Or why don't you write songs that more people can get into? And my argument would always be, number one, it's not what I feel like I should be doing, but there's a value, there's an importance to the indie level. It's not just that it's a lower tier. You don't think of it like baseball, where it's like the single A, double A, triple A, major leagues. They're all kind of in one pool. And without a robust indie scene, whether it's wrestling, music, podcasting, photos, whatever, then the entire picture gets so consolidated and boring at the very quote unquote top levels, the biggest levels.
Because everything's staged at that point. Whereas I believe indies represent and embody passion. Because prior to what I said earlier about most of the time when you're looking at the sports industry, the music industry at the mainstream level, the priority is the bottom line. Whereas you look at the indies, the most important priority is performance.
Yes.
Is how are you engaging the audience or the crowd that you're speaking to? Hence why you'll see a lot of independent wrestlers take very risky moves or try out new move sets despite the fact that, again, they're probably only being paid less than $50 per show.
Right.
And the same could be done with musicians as well, who will go out of their way to develop new songs, try out and experiment, and just kind of lay it all there on the stage and perform for minutes and minutes and hours on end, because that's where the passion lies. It's not so much about the fame or the money or the perception, but more so around how can we make sure that the audience feels engaged. Hence why, very similar to what you just said, the indies are so special and need to be supported, right? And I always make that argument that if you are going to go out of your way to spend an upwards of $100, right, to go and watch some performance at the Amp, you should be willing to shell out $25 to go visit your local bar to watch someone perform, whether it's, again, open mic, spoken word, talking about music, or we're talking about independent professional wrestling. Like, we need to be able to support our local talent the same way that we're supporting the mainstream talent, who quite frankly don't even know that we exist, aside from the fact that we just shelled out some money for them.
That's exactly right. So as a representative, you know, you're in this body that is, you know, the House of Representatives, and really the General Assembly as a whole has a significant role in Rhode Island politics. Some would argue the Speaker, in fact, anybody would probably argue the Speaker of the House is the most powerful position in Rhode Island politics, more so than the governor. And you entered in from a really important place, which is somebody with strong political philosophy, and married that with politics and did it in a successful way. Right now, we're in a moment where there's a lot of division amongst progressives in terms of tactics, in terms of how to put forth candidates, in terms of what to do once you're inside whichever office or body that you're in. And somehow you've been able to really thread the needle of both having a philosophy that you believe in and an ideology, if I will, that is specific. Yet at the same time, you're in the General Assembly, introducing legislation, making things happen. What's your advice to anybody out there that's listening in Rhode Island or otherwise about that balance, being effective in politics, but also being authentic in terms of your political philosophy and not trying to bury it like we see so many people do?
Well, generally, as a progressive, we have to be policy-oriented. We have to be policy-oriented as to what it is that we are trying to achieve in terms of improving the lives of working people. What are the material changes that we are seeking to improve? For example, when we talk about transforming healthcare, I always put it into two separate buckets. What are our long-term visions in addition to the short-term conditions that we can improve? The long term is establishing a single-payer Medicare for all healthcare system. And I will always make the argument that we do not have to wait for the national or federal government in order to implement a single-payer healthcare system. We could do it within Rhode Island, but it's going to take years to make that transition. In the short term, what we have direct control over is ensuring that we expand access to Medicaid, ensuring that you don't have to be quote-unquote dirt poor in order to qualify for Medicaid. If you are part of the squishy middle, where you are still struggling to make ends meet due to low wages, but the government tells you that you are too wealthy to qualify for Medicaid, how can we ensure that you still have access to high-quality health care without having to worry about out-of-pocket expenses? The same goes into prescription drugs as well. How do we ensure that we are directly capping and limiting the cost of prescription drugs? So I use that as an example, that we need to be very intentional with what our policy priorities are, aside from just leaning on the rhetoric that healthcare is a human right, which it absolutely is. But what is the policy that we are going to use to back up that rhetoric? And at the same time, how do we build those ongoing coalitions and partnerships? Because the rhetoric is what scares people away in terms of moderates and conservatives, because they don't want to be seen bunched in with the quote-unquote lefties, even though they might agree with the policies and the principles that you are trying to push forward. And one example I use is this year, for the third time, I have reintroduced legislation to specifically limit the cost and out-of-pocket expenses for specialty prescription drugs, which are the most expensive prescription drugs on the market, to $150 per 30-day supply, which would be the lowest in the nation alongside Maryland. Something I did back in the fall, I intentionally reached out to Leader Chippendale from the Republican Party and said, I know you have talked extensively about making sure people can afford their medication. This is legislation that would help us do this. I want to do it in collaboration with your caucus. And sure enough, his caucus agreed. And when you look at the bill, you will notice that it is Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. And again, a share of progressive Democrats in addition to the more moderate Democrats alongside Republicans who support the bill because they understand that the insurance companies are taking advantage of our communities the same way the pharmaceutical companies are as well. So how can we collectively stand up and ensure that we're passing policy that's going to do that? Mm-hmm. So I think it's, again, making sure we have policy to back up our rhetoric, making sure that we're controlling the messaging around what the policies are going to achieve in order to be able to build broad support.
That collaboration between Republicans and progressives is something that I think there should be much more of, because in a lot of ways it's an us versus them type of mentality of, hey, we're quote unquote the minority here in terms of representation in the chamber and even across the board. I mean, let's be honest about it. The idea that the General Assembly as a whole is the expression of the will of the people, that should unify everybody in that building for the most part. Maybe not everybody, but for the most part, everybody should be on a similar page when it comes to the interests of the people versus the interests of, frankly, corporate and sort of all-powerful type of bodies.
And I agree, but the reality is that those special corporate interests are influential. The Chamber of Commerce makes their points well heard during labor committee hearings when we talk about raising wages, as does the business coalition, as does the hospitality industry. Hence why I said that as we have our form of rhetoric in terms of people deserve to earn a living wage, we also need to have the messaging that supports it. And the messaging is, quite frankly, the fact that we're seeing record levels of inflation that are not tied to wage increases. Right. You have seen across Providence County, but specifically across the state, rents have increased by over 30% over the span of 2 years. The cost of a dozen of eggs on average is now over $4. Yet and still, wages have stayed stagnant. And so it's important that we throw that back at the face of the hospitality industry and the Chamber of Commerce. That way, any legislator who is siding with the Chamber of Commerce or the hospitality industry is going to be in an uncomfortable position where they will have to go back to their constituencies and say, we didn't move on this, and really not have much defense behind it. Because most of the time, and I think this was highly done more so like around the early 2010s within the General Assembly from what I was able to observe, is that a lot of legislators would hide behind the special interest to do the bidding and to do the rhetoric and be able to defend why we can't make progress. Whereas now we are exposing a lot of those lobbyists who come out, and you'll see it in a lot of back and forth committee hearings where committee members will question the validation of what the hospitality industry is trying to claim.
Right.
Because the idea has always been that if we improve the lives of working people, the sky is going to fall. When in reality, that is not the case, but instead it's highly popular amongst voters. And one point I always make is you will notice that anytime we pass progressive legislation, such as increasing the minimum wage to $15, legalizing cannabis alongside expungement, ensuring that undocumented people have access to driver's licenses, there is always a feel-good press conference that follows. Mm-hmm. And you will also notice a correlation where a lot of the legislators who voted in support of some of these progressive initiatives I just named, regardless of whether or not they were fully vocal during the time of passage, they'll likely include it as a bullet point on their next palm card for re-election.
Yeah.
So in other words, I am seeing this trend where progressive ideas receive positive traction from the media in addition to a positive reception from the voters. So I continue to make that push. This is clearly popular. Right. And it's important that we continue to build off that momentum. Hence why, like, one of the main priorities I have for this year is increasing our minimum wage to $20. Because we are in a situation, again, where the increase in cost of living is outpacing wages, as it has been for a long time, but it's a lot more evident now. And the fact that we're about to reach $15 by 2025 with no plan as to what to do by the time we reach the year 2026 and every year after that, that's concerning. And we need to make sure that we are ready to get to a $20 minimum wage and then adjust for inflation thereafter.
It's shocking that we've entered into this moment where rents and just the housing crisis as a whole is so extreme. And it really is. It really is a moment where, no, we don't see people by the tens of thousands, on the streets right now. But the number gets to 1,000 easily in terms of even just the documented unhoused population. The struggle that so many people are experiencing, whether it's renting a room, renting an apartment, renting a home, purchasing a home. I mean, come on. It's completely out of control. Pair that with, as you mentioned, the inflation, stagnant wages, wage stagnation, and just a looming sort of sense of, doom and gloom about our future. I feel that maybe it's artificial, but there's this notion that the bottom's going to fall out. We're going to either head into a recession or something terrible is about to happen. Is World War III about to start? There's this doom and gloom that's in the air. And if it's like, this isn't what our country, from the positive side of the country, when you look at just the ideals that are positive, not the negative aspects of the formation of the United States, of which there are clearly, but the ideals, this isn't what it's all about. It's not even close. We've gone way off course.
And the struggles that you described are unfortunately very accurate. We have situations where people are living in crowded homes. Folks are living in their car but are technically not defined as being homeless. People are in deep medical debt in addition to credit card debt. And a lot of that struggle, unfortunately, we do not always see covered either by the media or spotlighted on television. So we don't think it's happening. And not to mention, the same people who are struggling tend to not be politically engaged in the sense that they attend fundraisers or are lobbying at the State House. So everything that you described is the actual reality of what we are living in. The issue is that a lot of the decision makers are disconnected from that reality. Because we have a lot of bureaucrats, we have certain politicians who spend a lot of time at the State House, who spend a lot of time at different fundraising functions. And so they're not necessarily exposed to those daily struggles. And that's why I always go back to as well, like when we are developing policy, it has to be from the lens of a working person or a working family. And one thing that always keeps me grounded is just my own upbringing, how I grew up. I grew up to a single mom alongside public benefit programs being Medicaid, food stamps, and public housing. So every time I'm in the process of approaching policy, whether it's to vote for legislation or introducing my own, I always look at it from the lens of that single mom. Would my family have benefited from this policy? Would this have impacted us in a negative way? And that's what ultimately influences how I'm going to vote. However, I understand that a lot of other legislators, both either within the House, the Senate, or again, bureaucrats who are making decisions on how to spend money, may not look at certain policies that way. And I think that's why there's sometimes maybe a lack of urgency around these issues, because you said it perfectly. I mean, we've been dealing with the housing crisis now for a decade, but it's finally hitting its boiling point.
Yeah.
And now we're finally taking action. Yet, and still in the conversations that we're having about building new affordable housing, there is little to no discussion about controlling rents.
Right. And there's been arguments made, I think, of Brett Smiley, who became mayor of Providence. Obviously, if you don't have your head under a rock, you know Brett Smiley is the mayor of Providence. He was firmly against rent control during the Democratic primary for mayor, and it came up in a debate. And I remember, I don't know if it's because he's, his husband's involved in big time real estate and he's got some perspective there. I don't know if it's because of just a general philosophy that, studies that I don't necessarily know, or I don't know. I don't understand what the negative aspect of rent control is, other than that it imposes a restriction on the quote unquote free market. But the problem is when you have the free market get so far out of control that you have situations like this guy that you had in committee hearing that I interviewed, this Craig Bichio, who owns 40 Airbnbs in Newport, and you have just this complete runaway capitalism. It starts to become feudalism, and that by design is the reason why there are levers of control in a free market.
And it's harming people. At the end of the day, contemporary capitalism is harming people in the sense that folks cannot afford the basic necessities of shelter, food, medication, hence why we're seeing a rising level of our unhoused population. In addition to, we're seeing families living in crowded homes. You have children who are living in a home alongside five other family members, so they're forced to sleep in the living room.
Right.
And that's no upbringing that we should be forcing our youth to live through, but that's just the reality because of the struggle that their parents have to face. And that all trickles back down. And one crisis that I don't believe is receiving enough attention is what we've been seeing across human services. Yeah. Since 2019, we've had a human services crisis as it relates to staffing and the lack of accessibility that people who want to apply or check in on their applications related to SNAP, Medicaid, and Rhode Island Works have been facing. Because if you call DHS, you are going to be on the phone for over an hour. And we're hitting the tipping point now because of the fact that Medicaid renewals have started.
Yeah.
But we have to remember, Medicaid renewals are starting, and we're going to see an estimated upwards of 40,000 people lose their Medicaid. In addition to that, we saw a reduction in SNAP benefits. The average person lost about $90 in their SNAP benefits because of federal aid that expired. So I point those two emerging issues that have come up in terms of SNAP cuts and Medicaid cuts. The other piece that we're missing, though, and again, this is a symptom of the ongoing issue of DHS not having sufficient staff, is while all of this is happening, DHS still has over 4,000 backlogs in terms of cases that they're evaluating, whether it's approving people for a program or renewing their applications. So you have a combined backlog in addition to upcoming terminations, in addition to people who are wondering, why is my SNAP a lot less than it was in previous months?
Right.
And it's a recipe for disaster. And I've been very critical about the lack of urgency that has come from the executive branch, that has come from DHS, because none of this is a surprise, nor is it a secret. We know we've been dealing with staffing issues since 2019. We have 111 vacancies. What has been done to expedite the hiring process? And that's why I get back to my point of being disconnected from reality. That's what ends up happening within the systems of our government, is you see issues unfold and unravel, and it's not until it hits the peak that we realize, oh, we actually have to do something about this.
Completely. And this goes back, it goes back a while. It goes to the Deloitte crisis under Governor Raimondo, where, you know, this outside staffing agency, not staffing agency, pardon me, tech agency was designing and developing the software by which oftentimes DHS would process, you know, applications and so on and so forth. And that was a disaster. And you had people who were struggling at that point and couldn't get through. And then, of course, COVID came. And there was a wall, there's a barrier to access information. And a lot of times the media were serving as conveyors of information. I mean, I got a million people who messaged me, hey, how do I apply for this unemployment benefit? How do I get, you know, this particular relief grant, whatever it is? And I felt like that's not really my job, but ended up connecting people. And I'm like, how many other people are doing the same thing that I'm doing right now that are not paid bureaucrats or people who are, you know, even just low, quote unquote, lower level staffers. And it is a major thing. It's a major disconnect, and it's shocking. And you wonder, what is government for, if not for being able to serve the people of a given body, whether it's at the municipal, state, or federal, or eventually perhaps even a global scale? You know, what is the, or universal scale? Who knows? Maybe we'll have bases on Mars. And what's the point of
yeah,
it?
I mean, I always make the argument that programs that affect poor people tend to get less attention generally, especially from the government. So again, when we're talking about SNAP, when we're talking about Medicaid, when the chopping block hits, a lot of people don't bat an eye because, again, the people who are most impacted by cuts to Medicaid or cuts to SNAP are not the people at the fundraisers. They're not the ones who are super politically engaged. They might not be primary voters.
Right.
So oftentimes they're just discounted completely. Whereas if you make another cut to the budget, that will impact those who are politically connected. God forbid we do that. So again, I think it does go back to that importance of having increased representation across, again, all forms of government, city council, school committees, the General Assembly, about making sure that when we're talking about policy and budgetary priorities, that we are looking out for those who are most vulnerable and are suffering and not having to wait until the crisis hits its tipping point. Yeah. So one of the budget items I'm prioritizing this year is ensuring that if anyone gets terminated from their Medicaid, that they have at least 6 months of health insurance coverage through the exchange with premiums covered. The governor did put in his proposal to cover up to 2 months. However, it was means tested by 200% of the federal poverty level, which I think is insultingly low because 200% of the federal poverty level is essentially someone who makes $36,000 or less. Needless to say, if you make $39,000, you're not living in luxury. You shouldn't be forced to go and worry about how you're going to pay for your prescription drugs now that the government has kicked you off your Medicaid.
Yeah, you're still the working poor. There's no question about it. So you were in the midst of what, I don't know, this stupid idea of the progressive civil war is something that, you know, it's just so annoying. And it's just, you know, even just seeing some of the stuff on Twitter, I'm like, come on, you know, do you want to lose elections? But you were in the midst of an element of this where you had the endorsement of the DSA and you voted for the Speaker of the House to be Speaker, and DSA rescinded their endorsement of you. I got to ask, what was that like for you on a personal level? And, you know, just the human being, like what was that experience like? Because from the outside, you know, at one point I was like, I can understand both arguments here in that a DSA is saying we don't want any affiliation with establishment politicians or influencers in any way, shape, or form. That's what we stand for. That's what we believe in. There's no compromise. There's no room for politics. At the same time, do you want to get things done? Do you want to be an effective politician? Do you want to be an effective leader for your community? Do you want to advance the goals, many of which perhaps DSA have laid out in a meaningful way? So I guess it's a little bit of the incrementalism versus, you know, full-scale takeover type of conversation. But what was that like for you?
Yeah, so overall, I didn't think it was that controversial of a decision to vote for the Speaker. I say that because when I ran 3 years ago for office, I had campaigned on a $15 minimum wage, expanding healthcare specifically as it relates to Medicaid, and ensuring that we were getting to a point where education funding was more stabilized, specifically for Providence. And within the General Assembly in my first 2 years there, we delivered on a lot of those issues. And well, even beyond that, when I first abstained 2 years ago, a lot of it was due to the fact that I was not familiar with the leadership style of Shekarchi, Blazajewski, and others in leadership. So I gave those first 2 years to have an understanding of what that leadership style was, what the policy priorities would look like, what budgets we would potentially be voting on. And while it was not the full progressive budget that I would like to see, I think the fact that we increased Medicaid dental reimbursement rates for the first time in 24 years, we were able to cover all kids through the finish line and ensure that every undocumented child has access to health care. Like, those are meaningful victories. And that gave me the confidence to say, while I would like to have leadership in the future that boldly claims to be progressive and is always going to prioritize certain items that I would if I were speaker or governor as it relates to, again, Medicaid, SNAP, increasing wages. These are colleagues that I feel confident and comfortable working with on various issues.
Yep.
And that to me was the importance as to why I felt comfortable making that decision to vote for the speaker. And I think it ended up taking a life of its own when we saw continuous statements that did come out from the DSA, which, again, I was disappointed about. But at the end of it, it is also a democratic body in of itself. And if the membership voted to rescind the endorsement, then I'm not going to further engage in political drama. Hence why I always stay away from a lot of the quote-unquote progressive Civil War tweets, posts that go on, because my priority is just more centered around policy and really just trying to push a lot of these issues forward than to engage in debates with other fellow progressives who, again, I know I share similar goals with.
Sure. I always go back, for me, it's the ideal of, I think of myself sitting outside of this beautiful cafe that was in Brooklyn. It's called Potion. And it was like basically, anarcho-syndicalism personified, but we had this beautiful open mic. There was candle lit. It was filled with people working on physics problems. This one person was trying to develop a time machine. There were people writing songs, hanging out and having these deep conversations. I'm thumbing through Chomsky books to pull up, whatever idea, and just we're reaching. And then all of a sudden a kid showed up who was a Ron Paul fanatic, and you get into these debates and go outside and people are hanging out on the street and smoking or whatever it is. And it's like that space, I'll always cherish that space. That is like so foundational to my worldview and political view, is these discussions with, including sometimes conservative and libertarian people, progressive, socialists, people have no clue what's going on, that perspective. So there's that, and that's one thing. And then there's also the reality of, here's how the political system is built. So you can't expect the Potion Cafe for me, version of politics to be easily inserted into a political system. So what do? You either ignore it completely, and you just live in your cafe bubble. You abandon your cafe bubble and perhaps betray that version of yourself, or you find a way to thread the needle. I feel like that's what you've done, and there are others who have done that as well, which is like you haven't turned your back on anybody.
Exactly, nor have I taken a vote that I'm ashamed of or ever felt pressured to take if I didn't agree with a specific issue. And I think that's also my main takeaway is, by no stretch of the imagination have I ever, quote-unquote, sold out. And that's something I'm very conscientious of as well, because at the end of the day, my advocacy is for the working poor more than anything else. Is if I am actively harming people who make less than $70,000 a year, then I should not be within the realms of government, nor should anyone else. And that's what I define as selling out, is taking that money from corporate PACs and corporate lobbyists, which I have not. And similarly, my focus is also collaborating with organizations that are focused on pushing progressive policy for the purpose of trying to improve the lives of the people we just described, the working class, the working poor. And that's why I've always been excited to partner with Reclaim. They have an exciting campaign centered around social housing, working with the Working Families Party, who helped spearhead the increase for a $15 minimum wage and are now supporting me as we work towards a $20 minimum wage. Like, these are the groups that are actively on the ground doing the work, because they recognize that in order to improve the lives of working people, we have to have policies that are going to change the material conditions that we see in our daily lives.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't agree more. All right, last second here. Probably should ask this right at the top, because I don't know if maybe you've prepared balloons are going to drop down right now, confetti and balloons, but You running for Congress, Congressional District 1? Are you jumping in?
I am not. No, I am not running for Congress.
All right, we can take you
However,
off the list.
if I was running for Congress, my platform would be centered, and this goes for anyone that I may be supporting.
Yep.
That one's platform should be centered around reducing defense spending, making significant investments towards the social benefits programs that we've been talking about related to food stamps, related to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, while at the same time working towards a single-payer Medicare for all healthcare system. And I say that because as a congressperson, I do think their individual votes, while it may not make a difference in the long scheme of a budget or a policy item, it does shape influence in terms of what future budgets and policies might look like.
Absolutely. I feel like you're going to be mayor of Providence, or you have like this incredibly bright future ahead, and I think it's a really exciting thing. You've got the it factor of what makes like an appealing leader, and that's a very difficult skill. I think it comes from your wit and your humor, your policy understanding, your performance skills, which you've honed through wrestling and through improv as well. I know you do Kismet, which I've done some stuff at as well. And those are all ingredients that, like, I mean, we need characters. You know, I'm not going to call anybody out, but sometimes you go, boy, this race is boring. And it's like, let's get some excitement. Let's get some ideas. Let's take some risks.
And you said it perfectly. We need fresh ideas. And this idea that Republicans are bad, clean air is good, you deserve health care. We need to go well beyond that. Like, what are the specific ideas that you are bringing to the table that are actually going to help improve the lives of people, while at the same time also being able to demonstrate that you are not just the run-of-the-mill politician who is going to spend all their time buried under the desks of City Hall, buried under the desks of the governor's office, but instead are actively going to be engaging with the community. Hence, one point I wanted to make, and I would like to see a precedent of this in the future for all politicians at the local and state level, is seeing more levels of community engagement that go beyond just election year. I take pride in having hosted 22 community meetings since taking office. Most of them happen at Mount Pleasant Library, George J. West Elementary School. Some have literally taken place outside of people's yards. And the purpose for that is, again, being visible, connecting with the community, and most importantly, like hearing their thoughts on the ground, because I will emphasize it once more, the folks who are most impacted by policy decisions that are made at the state level are not the people who attend fundraisers, are not the people who are politically engaged lobbying at the State House.
Completely agree. David Morales, representative and champion. Woo!
Woo! No, thank you so much for having me, Bill.
My pleasure, brother.
Much appreciated. And like I said before, I mean, having this opportunity to be able to serve both as the RWA Hype Champion, but most importantly, the state representative for the city of Providence, has been an absolute honor. And my center and focus will, again, continue to be centered around working class and working poor individuals across our state and city.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.